You know, it was India's Independence Day recently, and it made me think about this topic. You've probably heard an old saying that says, if you stare into the abyss, eventually the abyss stares back. Something along these lines, I don't remember it exactly. Point being that once upon a time, Britain ruled over a large part of the planet.
At its height, the British Empire was the largest ever, covering around a quarter of the planet's land surface and ruling over 458 million people.
It was the British that invaded countries and established colonies, as well as their way of life and systems of governance on those colonies. Fast forward 100 years, and...
Well, how the turntables... In many British districts, the mayor's chair is occupied by Muslims. There are Pakistani grooming gangs in pretty much every town of the UK, like their bloody KFC franchisees.
Well, turning now to the so-called grooming gang scandal that's rocking Britain.
Now let's talk about Britain's grooming gang scandal.
It's actually swept the country. We've uncovered up to 50 different towns and cities where there are credible reports of grooming gangs taking place. We visited many of them.
Now, have you ever had sex with a white girl in your taxi?
Sex with a white girl in my taxi.
They identify clear evidence of over-representation among suspects of Asian and Pakistani heritage men.
I was just a little girl trying to get out of it, but trying to save everyone else while I was trying to get out of it myself.
There is open intimidation of non-Muslims by Islamists on British streets.
We have some breaking inputs coming in. Birmingham Temple terror truth is out now. In fact, the proof of planned anti-Hindu hate.
In Birmingham, after Leicester, mob surrounded a Hindu temple in Smethwick, and video shows hundreds surrounding a temple chanting religious slogans.
A rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the state and on UK's campus has led to action.
With parts of the political class of the UK completely beholden to this vote bank. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the Islamization of Britain and how the British policy of divide and rule that unleashed such devastation in India has now come back to bite them in the ass with a vengeance. It's got to be the world record for the longest duration example of karma ever. So to understand the current state of Britain, ironically, we must travel to the time which highlighted the height of British power, specifically the British Raj in India. During the British Raj, particularly in the 20th century, the British didn't merely tolerate Islamic separatism, they actively nurtured and protected it as a political weapon. From the early 20th century, the Raj went out of its way to support Islamist elements in India. They saw this as a great tool in their policy of divide and rule. Use the Islamic community that already had a built-in hatred of the non-Muslims, in India's case the Hindus, as a bulwark against the Hindu majority and its agitation against British rule. The Islamists were coddled and supported by the British on many occasions. In the early 1900s, anti-British protests were exploding across India. Bengal was a major hotspot, with the revolutionary groups like Anushilan Samiti directly challenging the empire. So the British solution to Bengal rebelling against them was to take a leaf out of Sunny Deol's playbook in the movie Jeet. If I can't have you, then I'll just destroy you. The British went to radicalize Muslims and split Bengal on communal lines to weaken the United Nationalist movement. But the British separatist strategy began in earnest with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who became one of the cornerstones of British efforts to win Muslim loyalty. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's collaboration with the British was comprehensive and unwavering. He advocated for complete Muslim loyalty to British rule, famously declaring that even if I were appointed the Viceroy of India, I would endeavour just as well to strengthen the rule of the Queen Empress in India. His political philosophy was clear. Muslims should remain aloof from anti-British activities and needn't join hands with the Hindus to rebel against British rule. The British rewarded this loyalty generously. Sir Syed Ahmad received official British patronage for establishing the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, later renamed the Aligarh Muslim University, in 1875.
This institution became more than an educational center. It was a training ground for pro-British Muslim administrators and a breeding ground for separatist ideology. The famous Shimla Deputation of October 1906 also marked a watershed moment in British Muslim political collaboration. Led by Aga Khan III, 35 prominent Muslims met with Viceroy Lord Minto to demand separate political representation. This meeting was far from spontaneous, by the way. The British administration had been cultivating the idea of separate electorates as a means to counter growing Hindu agitation against the British Empire. Lord Minto, a full-time twat, was also side-hustling as the Viceroy of India, and he actively encouraged the foundation of the Muslim League as a rival organization to the Indian National Congress, promising consideration of Muslim demands. You also had the Indian Councils Act of 1909, which represented the first major legislative victory for the British divide and rule policy. The act granted separate electorates to Muslims, with Lord Minto earning the title Father of the Communal Electorate. Under this system, Muslim members could only be elected by Muslim voters, effectively legalizing communalism in Indian politics. The principle of weightage gave Muslims disproportionate representation in areas where there were minorities, while thanks to the British, the Muslims continued to enjoy minority status even in states like Punjab and Bengal, where they were in a majority. Under the Government of India Act of 1935, Muslims received 33.33% of the seats in the federal legislature, despite being just over 20% of the population of India. In fact, even Muhammad Ali Jinnah was surprised by how much support he was receiving from the British for his separatist goals. As Jinnah later noted, after the war began, I was treated on the same basis as Mr. Gandhi, who had far more popular support. I was wonderstruck why I was promoted and given a place side by side with Mr. Gandhi. Imagine the guy who partitioned an ancient civilization, led to the deaths and displacement of tens of millions of people, saying that the British were being a bit too obvious. It's like Hitler looking at somebody's anti-Semitism and going,
fellas?
The British were insistent on recognizing the separatist and radical Muslim League as the sole representative of India's Muslims. By 1946, when Britain was expected to leave but had no concrete exit plan, which prompted Muslim League leaders to call for Direct Action Day on 16th August 1946, which was marked by incendiary speeches and open calls for violence. And as a result, mass carnage followed. Tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded, tens of thousands left homeless and forced to flee their ancestral land. The British did nothing despite being aware of the impending violence, showing further support for the Muslim League, its leaders, and the Muslim League's goals of balkanizing India. In fact, the legacy of these separate electorates introduced by the British continues to influence Indian politics through identity-based political mobilization, even today. So I'm sure that after a bloody partition, millions of deaths, tens of millions displaced, the British leaders of the Raj were happily sitting in the British countryside, patting themselves on the back over a job well done. But little did they know that their policies and actions in India would come back to haunt them at home many decades later, like the world's longest distance boomerang. So the partition of India happened with roughly less planning than goes into choosing what to watch on Netflix for lunch.
Radcliffe had never visited British India or written about it ever in his professional life as a lawyer. He virtually had no knowledge of the subcontinent.
I left this bloody line. Yes, that's what it is.
But Britain unwittingly became Dr. Frankenstein and created their monster through this process, the monster being Pakistan. So let's see how this happened. While India was going through its partition problems, Britain, on the other hand, had problems of its own. They had lost a lot of their working age population to the Second World War and had to rebuild the country in many ways. Cities were bombed out, factories were empty, and the workforce was so depleted that you could fit the entire workforce in a fake taxi. Sorry, I mean a London taxi. Not that I know anything about that fake taxi. I don't know where that came from. So the British government came up with an idea. They decided that they would use labor in their former colonies to help and rebuild the empire that had spent centuries spanking them.
The UK saw a huge investment in public infrastructure. So cities that were bombed were rebuilt, transport systems were expanded, and new institutions, including the National Health Service or NHS, had to be staffed. So people from former colonies, now known as the Commonwealth, came to the UK to fulfill this labor shortage.
And so Britain created the British Nationality Act of 1948, essentially the world's most passive-aggressive invitation. People came from all over erstwhile British colonies like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Middle East, and India. And this was the start. As a result of this influx, many areas in Britain developed a large Muslim population.
They're facing it way more than here, but
95% dominating Muslim.
Islam is currently thriving in the UK, especially in London and Birmingham, with the Muslim population increasing by 44% in a decade.
The #1 most common baby name in the UK is Muhammad right now. Plus, the number of Muslim reverts in the UK is growing, while Christianity is declining. The Mayor of London is a Muslim. Plus, the Mayor of Oxford, Lutton, Rockdale, Oldham, Brighton, and Hove are all Muslims.
And after this came the 70s and 80s and the big idea of these 2 decades, multiculturalism. The divide and rule policy, but for Britain, not for the colonies. Now, not for a second am I trying to suggest that multiculturalism is a bad thing. In fact, it can be a very good thing. Living peacefully with mutual respect and mutual benefit with different cultures, different outlooks, different perspectives, and different skills will likely enrich your country culturally and economically. I am speaking specifically about multiculturalism as it's being practiced in the UK and many Western countries. This was Britain's way of saying that we're not going to force you to integrate. You do you, we'll just pretend that we're all best friends. It's like inviting a new roommate into your house and then letting them redecorate half of it while you promise not to touch any of their stuff. By the early 1990s, about 95% of the UK local authorities had adopted multiculturalism or anti-racist policies. Sounds great. Schools integrated multiculturalism elements into curricula to promote diversity awareness and inclusion. Sounds great. But just like Anakin Skywalker when he was a Jedi, there was a dark side that was never really addressed until it was too late. In the 21st century, David Cameron, in a now famous speech, announced that multiculturalism had failed.
Under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream. We failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. We've even tolerated these segregated communities behaving in ways that run completely counter to our values. So when a white person holds objectionable views, racist views for instance, we rightly condemn them. But when equally unacceptable views or practices come from someone who isn't right, we've been too cautious, frankly even fearful, to stand up to them. This hands-off tolerance has only served to reinforce the sense that not enough is shared. And this all leaves some young Muslims feeling rootless. And the search for something to belong to and something to believe in can lead them to this extremist ideology.
And it was particularly due to one reason. In fact, it wasn't just David Cameron who said it, but German leader Angela Merkel and French leader Nicolas Sarkozy made similar declarations, with Merkel stating that multiculturalism had utterly failed in Germany. Sarkozy criticized the focus on the identity of the new arrivals rather than the identity of the country receiving them, specifically mentioning Islam and calling for a French Islam and not just an Islam in France. And ultimately, what Cameron said turned out to be true. Cameron said that the ethnic British and the Muslim immigrants don't have enough in common. We have never asked the Muslims to be part of us or part of our culture. The multiculturalism in the UK was defined by the soft bigotry of low expectations. The soft bigotry of low expectations refers to a form of prejudice where individuals or groups are assumed to be incapable of achieving high standards due to their background, race, religion, or socioeconomic status. And this assumption is masked as kindness or understanding. It leads to setting lower academic, professional, social, or economic expectations for certain groups, often based on stereotypes about their background. This is the attitude that Britain adopted towards its Muslim immigrants. Well, it's in their culture. Well, their culture is to have multiple wives. Well, in their culture, women don't work. In their culture, women don't have rights. That's just how they are. We don't need to interfere with their culture and give the women more rights. And stop forced arranged marriages and stop honor killings. In Britain, they were happy to castigate British people because British people are part of British culture. They're British, but you're Muslim and you're different. Your culture is different and separate from British culture, so we'll just leave you be. And this is exactly the divide and rule policy that the British used in India to devastating effect, and unknowingly adopted the very same policy in their own country a few decades later. More than a decade after David Cameron's speech, former British Home Minister Suella Braverman in 2023 described this multiculturalism as a misguided dogma that had allowed people to come to our society and live parallel lives, and warned that in extreme cases, they could pursue lives aimed at undermining the stability and threatening the security of society. And this policy of soft bigotry of low expectations has created some really worrying attitudes in Britain. In a Pew poll from 2013, more than half of the Muslims of Britain believed that homosexuality should not be legal in Britain. Nearly half of British Muslims believe that it was unacceptable for a gay person to become a teacher and teach their children. A Channel 4 documentary in 2015 revealed that although 78% of British Muslims said that they like being British and they would like to integrate into British life, but they would still like to have separate Islamic schooling and separate laws like they have in India. Nearly a quarter supported the introduction of Sharia law in Britain, and 39% agreed that wives must always obey their husbands, compared to 5% of the country as a whole. Nearly a third of British Muslims thought that it was acceptable for a British Muslim man to have more than one wife. 25% of British Muslims disagreed that violence against those publishing images of the Prophet Muhammad could never be justified. 25% were sympathetic to the motives of the Charlie Hebdo killers. Remember that Charlie Hebdo was a left-wing satirical French magazine that had published a cartoon of the Islamic Prophet Muhammad, and in response to that, Islamic terrorists had stormed their offices and murdered multiple Charlie Hebdo employees. This was widely celebrated by the Islamic world and many Muslims in Europe. Melanie Phillips, in her book Londonistan in 2006, documented how Britain became what she termed the European hub for the promotion, recruitment, and financing of Islamic terror and extremism. Phillips argued that this flawed application of multiculturalism and accommodation allowed radical Islamism to flourish unchecked. A research by Policy Exchange found that 61% of ethnic minority children start education in schools where ethnic minorities form the majority. This pattern of self-segregation extends beyond schools into residential areas as well. The 2015 Survation poll for the BBC found that 33% of UK Muslims wanted children educated separately from non-Muslims. And as a result of these attitudes, Muslim women have the lowest employment rates of any religious group at just 29%, compared to a 46% point gap with Christian women. Among the economically active Muslim population aged 16 to 74, only 19% are in full-time employment compared to 35% of the overall population. Local councils started funding cultural centers and mother tongue schools to accommodate these Muslim demands. It was around the same time that Sharia councils started in certain areas in the UK. At first, they were just elders helping families settle disputes, kind of like Judge Judy, but eventually they got bigger and more organized. In certain communities, people started treating Sharia rulings more important than even British law. So there were clearly many warning signs, and still British society mostly ignored this discrepancy. It's like with certain conservative politicians who complain way too much about gay people and then end up getting busted with hundreds of gigabytes of gay porn. The signs were there, but ultimately this flawed implementation of multiculturalism and the British turning an eye to the various signs they were getting of increased radicalization within the Muslim community ultimately led to arguably the biggest black eye and collective shame on modern British society, the grooming gang scandals. In the early 2000s, towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford had gangs of mostly British Pakistani Muslim men who were targeting young British girls. We're talking systematic, organized abuse that went on unchecked for decades.
And they groom them, and the grooming period is they give them trainers, they give them phones, they give them alcohol, cigarettes, and they're nice to them at first. And then they get their confidence and they separate them from their family. They say your mum and dad don't trust you. They treat you like a little child. And there's a process that these children go through. And then they get them into sexual relationships with one man at first. And then that man will manipulate the girl, and before they know it, there's 10 men on them. And then literally, there's stories.
Official reports estimated over 1,400 victims in Rotherham alone between 1997 and 2013. In Telford, there were around 1,000 victims. And these are official numbers. In reality, the figures are probably much higher, because for every girl that spoke up, dozens stayed silent out of fear, shame, or sheer disbelief that the authorities would help. And this is where it gets really sad, because the police, social workers, and local councils knew it was happening.
I was held hostage for days at a time. This all went on for a 5-year period.
Just to show the numbers of girls abused in Bradford completely outweigh.
Even the grooming gangs, if you speak to some of the victim survivors, they say that the way that they operate are more similar to terrorist network operations as opposed to just, kind of rape gangs.
They had reports, they had testimonies, they had direct complaints from parents, and yet they did nothing. Because many perpetrators were Pakistani Muslim men, and so the officials were terrified of being labeled racist or Islamophobic. So instead of arresting these abusers, they decided that the real criminal was people who were reporting it. Imagine if Thanos was looking for the Infinity Stones in order to wipe out half the universe, and then the Avengers actually beat the shit out of some random pedestrian because he went up to the Avengers and said, "Hey guys, Thanos is over there. You guys should better catch him. But this story somehow gets even more horrific. These grooming gangs weren't just operating in Rotherham and Telford.
And so in the documentary in February, we uncovered up to 50 different towns and cities where we believe that these grooming gangs have credible reports of them going on.
50 bloody towns and cities. There are probably more grooming gangs in an average British town than fish and chip shops at this point. For years, the British press barely touched this story. And when they did actually cover this story, they did the most weaselly thing possible. They labeled these Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs Asian grooming gangs. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that there were a bunch of Mongolians, Thai, and Laotians running these grooming gangs. Wait a second. There aren't any Mongolians, Thai, and Laotians in these grooming gangs. Then why smear them by calling these Asian grooming gangs? Imagine if someone in your university got caught watching Smurf and Family Guy porn, and then the media says everyone in your university, including you, loves watching Smurf and Family Guy porn, even if you don't, because you watch the nastier stuff. It's okay. No judgment here. So in Britain, Asian became code for mostly Pakistani Muslim men, but were too afraid to say it. It wasn't until journalists and a few stubborn MPs forced public inquiries that the scale of the abuse finally became impossible to ignore. The 2014 J report on Rotherham ripped the lid off, revealing systemic failures by the police and council, all underpinned by a fear of being called Islamophobic.
And it showed that there was a minimum of 1,400 children in my hometown in a certain period of time that had been groomed, abused, raped, tortured, trafficked, and some even murdered.
Yeah, a very good report, has some really shocking things in it. Like there's one section where it talks about a denial, pages and pages on the denial that's gone on. And it's now like, oh, okay, suddenly we can admit that this is what's been going on. And
grooming gang victims in Rotherham have said that corrupt police officers worked alongside the gangs or failed to act on their abuse. 5 women have come forward to say that they were abused by police officers alongside the gangs.
It's a simple title, but it summarises decades of failures.
This soft bigotry of low expectations created a level of segregation and extremism such that MI5 reported that 75% of their caseload involved monitoring Islamist threats, and Islamist terrorism remains the most significant threat to the UK, accounting for nearly 70% of attacks since 2018. So by 2010, Britain had a big concentrated Muslim population in key cities where they had basically said to these Muslims, don't bother blending in, just do you, no need to become part of British culture. And ultimately, this led to even more dire consequences. According to some estimates, almost 1,000 British citizens are estimated to have traveled to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS since the group's rise to prominence in 2014. This figure includes both combatants and supporters who engaged in various activities for the group.
Just American citizens fighting alongside ISIS. British citizens are doing the same. One is suspected in the murder of the American journalist.
In fact, one of the most infamous ISIS executioners was named Jihadi John, who was an Islamist from the UK. And you might think that at this point, this extremism was only limited to affecting the white Anglo-Saxon Christian British. But that's simply not true. It was affecting other well-integrated minority communities in the UK as well. The Jewish community has been long complaining about Islamic extremism and intimidation at the hands of these Islamists. These examples that I'm presenting are from before the Hamas attack in 2023.
In the first 6 months of 2021, there was a record spike in anti-Semitism.
We recorded over 600 anti-Semitic incidents in a 1-month period.
The Hindu community in 2022 faced a mass-scale riots from Islamists in Leicester.
Violence erupted in Leicester and the situation on ground continues to remain tense, where hundreds of people crowded the streets in the city's eastern section after a spate of targeted attacks on Hindus that were reported, where armed Islamists attacked Hindus and their residences in the vicinity.
This is what happened. Clearly there was a Durga temple and it was under some kind of attack. The police controlled the situation, so fortunately it was not really damaged, but yes, the situation escalated.
And it was a very aggressive mob. They pelted bottles into the temple. They tried to scale the wall, as you've been reporting and as we have been seeing.
You can see the speech which Mohammed Hijab made in Leicester, and that has all of these elements of who these people are, what do they worship. So it really targets the very essence of Hinduism. So there is a deeper sense of Hindu-phobia.
But the pulse is that the small radical Islamist groups are
forcing Hindu communities to evacuate their homes. And that's fundamentally what's been happening. What happened 2 weeks ago with the India-Pakistan match was just a trigger. This has been going on for months on end.
Going to come out like that again? No. Because if they do come out, are we going to be here, yes or no?
The Sikh community has for decades been complaining about their own problems with these Muslim grooming gangs, with these gangs actively targeting young Sikh girls.
Grooming is a horrible thing. Grooming is very, very bad. And when somebody does it and targets a community or a religion for grooming, it's even bad than it's worse. It's horrible.
Right.
I've seen many, many cases.
When she was 15, Napreet, not a real name, claimed she was blackmailed with sexual explicit photos into prostitution by the man she thought loved her.
I would wake up drugged and they would force drinks down me. And I remember times where I would wake up and there would be like 5 people in a room.
Fighting other men?
Yeah.
So these are minority communities who have by and large integrated very well into British society. But the British just assume that because these communities did, so will everyone else. Ultimately, groups like the Muslim Council of Britain became the middlemen between the government and the Muslim communities of Britain. Soon, Muslim-majority wards started electing people who openly pushed for religious accommodations, just like separate electorates in India. You can clearly see the parallels between the British policy of divide and rule and the British policy of multiculturalism at home. The way the divide and rule policy of the British in India coddled the radical Islamic leadership of the Muslim League is the exact same thing that the British political and social leaders are doing with the radical Islamic leadership in their own country. The lack of integration of the Muslim community in the UK is compounded further by the Muslim population growth. The UK Muslim population has grown from 2.7% in 2001 to 6% in 2021, with projections suggesting it could reach nearly 20% by 2050. Some cities like Birmingham, Leicester, and parts of London already have Muslim populations exceeding 30%. Fun fact, that India was partitioned when the Muslim population was under 25%. And in 2050, British Muslims are going to reach close to that number. According to the Henry Jackson Society, out of 220 of the UK's most marginal seats, Islam is the largest minority religion in 129 of them, which is almost 60%. This means that in more than half of the seats that decide the next Prime Minister, the Muslim vote can literally decide who will live in 10 Downing Street. And in the UK's first past the post system, you do not need a massive majority. Just a few hundred votes can swing it. So now what's happening is big national parties like Labour are bending over backwards to appease the Muslim votes. Look at Jeremy Corbyn, who used to be the leader of the Labour Party. And when he was the leader of the Labour Party, he had a long track record of anti-Semitism. He was accused of sympathizing with anti-Jewish terrorists and paying tributes to them. Photographs in Daily Mail claim to show Corbyn paying respects to the graves of 4 Palestinians involved in the infamous 1972 Munich massacre. In that attack, Palestinian terrorists took members of the Israeli Olympic team hostage, and 11 Israeli athletes were killed. In fact, Jewish groups have provided a list of 9 instances of outright anti-Semitism by Jeremy Corbyn. So you have political parties in the UK that are appeasing their Muslim vote bank, just like the British government in India was appeasing the Muslim League. In fact, things got so bad that he was suspended by the Labour Party for his anti-Semitic activities after the Labour Party lost the elections. But just like the Islamic extremists that the British coddled in India, today they're finding out that when these radicals have power, they have no interest in working with you anymore. Despite all these attempts by the Labour Party to appease Muslim voters, Labour lost to radical pro-Palestinian independent candidates in pretty much all areas with significant Muslim populations.
In areas with high Muslim densities, they lost heavily, which dragged their performance down overall. Oldham, they lost the council. Manchester, they lost the VP. Birmingham, what should have been a walk in the park.
Labour lost Dewsbury and Batley in West Yorkshire and Blackburn in Lancashire, both constituencies with roughly 45% Muslim populations. And so, because of the UK's soft bigotry of low expectations and acceptance of segregation, many of these immigrant neighbourhoods rank among the poorest in the UK. According to the 2021 census and deprivation data, 40% of British Muslims live in the 20% most deprived districts nationally. Remember how I said Muslims make up just 6% of the UK population? But according to a report by the House of Commons, they make up nearly 20% of the UK prison inmates. Economically, things are also not great. More than 2/3 of the Muslim community in England and Wales live in areas with some of the highest unemployment rates in the country. About 2.6 million Muslims are living in local authorities where more than 1 in 20 people aged 16 to 64 are unemployed. Muslims in England and Wales had the highest unemployment rate among any religious group in the UK. So it is quite ironic that the game that the British played in India that tore India apart was the same game being played by British political and social leaders in their own country, which has now created a real Frankenstein's monster for them to deal with. And to be fair, it doesn't look like the British have any good solutions for this problem. And if the British do not deal with this problem, I'm afraid they're going to have other bigger problems down the road. It's going to inevitably lead to radicalization of a section of the ethnic British who will most likely learn the wrong lessons from this problem. They will not spend the time and effort in analyzing the minorities that are integrating well and those that aren't, and instead put all immigrant groups in their crosshairs, which is a shame again because essentially you're penalizing immigrant groups who have assimilated well.
Invaders, and you need to go home!
A stark message from anti-migrant protesters.
This is why it's very important for immigrant groups to speak up about this in a serious way. Many immigrant communities are interested in some bullshit version of solidarity rather than calling out the problem as it is. Remember that despite the targeting of Sikh girls, many Sikh leaders love to show solidarity with the same radical groups that are targeting their young girls. Remember that after the 2022 riots in Leicester against the Hindus, many Hindu organizations and many Hindu temples, priests and leaders were doing solidarity press conferences with the same Islamists that had encouraged these riots and had spewed vitriol against the Hindus during these riots. This is a level of cuckery that only belongs on Pornhub, not within these immigrant communities. This is a wake-up call not just for the ethnic British, but also for the immigrant communities that have integrated well in these countries. Because ultimately, when the shit hits the fan and the native population of Britain does get radicalized, they're not going to differentiate between the Muslims and the Jews and the Sikhs and the Hindus and the Buddhists. So nut up and speak up. And I want to ask you, do you agree with my assessment? What do you think happens with Britain in the next decade or the next 2 or 3 decades? Let me know your comments in the comment section down below. And how does Britain solve this problem? And how do the immigrant communities in Britain that are integrating well differentiate themselves or speak up and be heard better so as to not be swept up in this anti-immigrant sentiment that is developing all across Europe? Other than that, guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, let me know what I should make the next video on. I will see you for the next episode. And to all of you, a secular pranam.